one finds oneself reflecting, in these turbulent currents that buffet the ship of state, upon the fundamental architecture of a nation's governance. It is a contemplation not born of abstract academic pursuit, but forced upon us by the palpable pressures of a reality seemingly intent on testing the very sinews of our collective life. There is, one must confess from the outset, no romantic attachment here to the abrupt seizure of power, the dramatic flourish of military intervention that shatters the established, however imperfect, legal framework. The image of boots crushing, the delicate parchment of constitutional order, of uniformed figures replacing civilian deliberation with fiat, holds no allure. Such actions, often cloaked in the urgent rhetoric of salvation or necessary recalibration, invariably carry within them the seeds of profound disorientation, pulling the national fabric taut until it risks tearing irrevocably. The notion that the intricate, often frustrating maladies of a democratic system can be purged or healed through its violent overthrow strikes this observer as a profound and dangerous fallacy. A constitution, in its ideal form, is not merely a set of rules. It is a living, breathing covenant, a repository of collective aspirations and hard-won compromises. It is, paradoxically, both the site where societal ailments may manifest most acutely and the essential pharmacopoeia for their potential cure. Whatever wounds it sustains must find their balm within its own inherent mechanisms and spirit. External, forceful amputation offers not recovery, but only the certainty of a deeper, more traumatic injury. Military coups, for all their superficial promise of imposed stability and swift resolution, introduce an element of fundamental instability, a rupture in the continuity of legitimate authority that ultimately unleashes forces far less predictable and controllable than the democratic process they displace. It remains in this estimation that the path towards genuine, sustainable national renewal, however arduous and fraught with missteps it may be, lies solely through the continued, often painful engagement with the democratic instrument, refining it, defending it, and holding it accountable. It is against this backdrop, this deeply held conviction regarding the indispensable, if challenging, nature of democratic engagement, that one must necessarily frame the current, grinding economic predicament engulfing our nation. The pervasive atmosphere of financial distress, the relentless erosion of purchasing power, the increasingly visible markers of widespread privation, these conditions do not exist in a vacuum. They are rather the fertile ground in which a particular kind of politics takes root and flourishes, a politics that emboldens those who favor centralized power, who view individual liberties and the space for open discourse not as cornerstones of a healthy society, but as inconvenient obstacles to be managed, contained, or simply swept away. When the foundations of daily life become unstable, when hope dwindles and the structures meant to mediate between the citizen and the state, institutions of governance, avenues for redress, channels for expression, appear increasingly brittle and unresponsive, the environment becomes uniquely hospitable to the authoritarian impulse. It is precisely during such precarious moments, when the weight of hardship presses down on the populace, that the imperative to champion democratic remedies, however imperfect or slow they may seem, becomes paramount. The seductive allure of strongman solutions, the promise of decisive action unburdened by tedious process or accountability, must be resisted in favor of the often messy, yet ultimately more resilient, path of constitutional engagement. The raw statistics of our current economic reality paint a stark and troubling picture. Food inflation rates soaring beyond 40% transform the simple act of feeding one's family into a daily struggle for survival for vast swathes of the population. The escalating cost of fuel injects inflationary pressures into every corner of the economy, making transportation, commerce, and daily movement increasingly prohibitive. The relentless depreciation of the national currency against international benchmarks not only erodes wealth, but signifies a deeper loss of confidence, impacting everything from import costs to the dreams of those seeking opportunity beyond our borders. Meanwhile, the ranks of the unemployed swell, poverty deepens its hold, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness settles over communities. This confluence of economic pressures creates an environment ripe for social unrest and political instability. Disturbingly, amidst this backdrop of national hardship, the response emanating from the administrative center appears less focused on alleviating the palpable suffering of the citizenry and more attuned to managing the flow of information and suppressing expressions of discontent. There is a discernible pattern emerging, one that involves the deployment of state institutions, ostensibly designed to uphold law and order or combat financial malfeasance, as instruments for curtailing critical voices and shrinking the space for civic engagement. This constitutes a worrying pivot, suggesting that the priority has shifted from addressing the root causes of distress to controlling the narrative and stifling the inevitable frustrations that arise from such difficult circumstances. The recent apprehension and continued detention of the social activist widely known as Very Dark Man serves as a particularly salient and disquieting illustration of this trend. The stated justification offered by the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission points vaguely to petitions bordering on sundry issues of alleged financial crimes. Yet the specifics remain shrouded in opacity. No formal charges have been publicly disclosed. The fundamental expectation of transparency in matters involving state power and individual liberty has been conspicuously unmet. Instead, silence has been the dominant response, coupled with the persistent reality of incarceration. This unfolding scenario appears to follow an increasingly familiar and deeply concerning script: anonymous or vaguely sourced complaints, coupled with generalized accusations, leading to indefinite detention without the due process of clearly articulated charges and access to legal recourse in a timely manner. Such actions, when viewed collectively, begin to resemble less the methodical pursuit of justice and more a targeted campaign aimed at generating an atmosphere of fear, where the true objective is not the eradication of corruption, but the silencing of critique, the deterrence of independent thought and public commentary. In a parallel development emanating from the historical city of Benin, we witnessed the arrest and subsequent charging of human rights advocates Marxist Edokpai Kola and Orako Hansen. Their alleged transgression, participating in what was termed an unlawful procession. The substance of their offense appears to have been the public display of a banner expressing solidarity with Ibrahim Traore, the transitional leader in Burkina Faso, a figure who has, intentionally or otherwise, become a potent symbol of defiance against perceived external influence and a rallying point for certain strands of Pan-African sentiment in the sub-region. Edokpai and Hansen were eventually released several days after their initial apprehension, under circumstances that, in the perception of many observers, suggested a strategic retreat or a recalibration on the part of the State Security Service, implying that the initial action might have been ill-considered or prompted by an overreaction to the perceived symbolism of the protest. One is compelled to ponder the underlying connection between these two seemingly disparate incidents. What nexus exists between the government's actions against a lone social commentator, operating primarily within the digital sphere and perceived by some as holding a mirror to the excesses of state power and its associated functionaries? Those who might see themselves as inheritors of a kind of civilizing mandate, even in a post-colonial context, and the reaction to individuals expressing solidarity with a foreign soldier statesman from a neighboring country. Why would the mere mention, let alone public affirmation, of Ibrahim Traore's name or image provoke such a swift and heavy-handed response from the apparatus of state security? There is perhaps a paradox at play here, one deeply embedded in the nature of power, particularly in contexts where legitimacy feels fragile. Those who position themselves as saviors, as the necessary agents of order and progress, often find themselves paradoxically constructing the very conditions for deeper societal unease. The independent activist, armed primarily with their voice, their convictions, and the amplifying effect of public disaffection, represents a challenge not through force, but through the simple act of articulating inconvenient truths. Against this stands the state, adorned with the symbols and structures of modern governance, yet resorting to the age-old tools of coercion and the apparatuses designed to maintain a physical monopoly on violence, often deployed in ways that appear disproportionate and at times almost absurd when confronting mere words or symbolic gestures. What poses a genuine threat to the established order in such instances is not the physical act of dissent itself, but the uncomfortable reflection it casts upon the inherent contradictions of that power, a government that speaks of civilization while engaging in repression, that champions reform while shrinking from scrutiny, that claims to be fostering hope while actions appear to secure hopelessness as an unintended yet profitable outcome for those who benefit from the status quo. It is in that unflinching reflection, provided by critical voices and inconvenient symbols, that the veneer of legitimacy begins to thin, revealing the underlying anxieties. Yet, the explanation extends beyond mere internal contradiction. It is also deeply intertwined with the very essence of what the figure of Ibrahim Traore has come to represent, particularly in the regional imagination. At a relatively young age, 36 years old, he embodies a youthful, distinctly Pan-African assertion that openly challenges the lingering influence of former colonial powers, specifically France, and champions principles of economic sovereignty and political autonomy. In a continent often led by figures who have occupied positions of power for decades, if not longer, Traore represents a significant anomaly, and anomalies, by their very nature, introduce unpredictable variables that can unsettle established systems and long-standing power dynamics. Traore's ascent to power, facilitated by a military intervention that removed a government perceived as closely aligned with French interests in Ouagadougou, was followed by actions signaling a deliberate pivot, steps towards nationalizing key assets, a visible effort to reduce reliance on and ties with foreign military presence, and a rhetoric that emphasizes national dignity and self-reliance. He speaks a language of self-determination and accountability, resonating powerfully with a younger generation across the continent who perceive themselves as having been let down by their leaders, by the failure of post-independence governance to deliver on its promises. This then illuminates the source of the disquiet within our own government. The concern is not rooted in any plausible assessment of a direct military threat emanating from Burkina Faso. The unease stems, rather, from the perceived political contagion of Traore's example. In our own national context, the demographic bulge of young people is characterized by a profound and growing restlessness. There is a palpable weariness with the recycling of political elites, with leaders whose careers span decades and who are seen as representing a continuity with past failures rather than a bridge to a different future. This disillusionment fuels a search for alternative models, for inspiration from figures who dare to challenge the prevailing global order, who articulate a vision of local control over national resources, and who appear to prioritize the welfare and aspirations of their own citizens above external allegiances or established conventions. Ibrahim Traore, in this reading, much like the iconic figure of Thomas Sankara before him, embodies that elusive sense of possibility, that spark of defiance and hope. And in a climate where economic despair is widespread and political avenues for change feel constrained, hope, particularly when embodied by a relatable, resonant figure, can be perceived as profoundly destabilizing by those who benefit from the status quo. Consequently, rather than directing the full force of administrative capacity and political will towards confronting the escalating cost of living, the crisis of unemployment, and the pervasive insecurity that afflicts communities, the focus appears to have shifted towards controlling public discourse and suppressing civic expression. State institutions like the EFCC, the SSS, and the police, whose mandates are rooted in ensuring financial integrity, national security, and public order respectively, seem increasingly repurposed as instruments of censorship and intimidation. The trajectory is clear, from journalists seeking to inform to social media influencers shaping public opinion, from human rights activists advocating for justice to union leaders organizing collective action, anyone perceived as questioning the system, challenging official narratives, or mobilizing public sentiment risks facing the heavy hand of state reprisal, manifesting as arrests, detentions, or various forms of harassment and threat. It is within this overarching framework that the actions taken against individuals like Very Dark Man, Edokpai, and Hansen acquire their deeper significance for many citizens. Their troubles are not widely perceived as stemming from genuine criminal wrongdoing. Instead, they are viewed through the lens of political persecution, as punitive measures enacted in response to acts of dissent, for daring to articulate unwelcome truths to power, for openly aligning themselves, symbolically or otherwise, with the plight of the less privileged in our society, and, notably in the case of the Benin activists, for expressing solidarity with a foreign leader who is seen as embodying principles that stand in stark contrast to the perceived orientation and priorities of our own government. This constellation of events inevitably prompts a series of probing questions. Why, one might ask, does the current administration exhibit such a marked degree of apprehension? What is the root cause of this apparent fear? Could it be the unsettling possibility that citizens might begin to ask a fundamental question? Why not us? Why are we subjected to this economic hardship? Why are our institutions faltering? Why is the space for dissent shrinking? Furthermore, why would a simple banner displayed in a regional city, expressing solidarity with a foreign leader, be perceived as posing an existential threat to the authority of the state? The answer, disarmingly simple yet profoundly revealing, lies at the heart of legitimacy itself. When the basis of leadership feels shaky, when power is perceived as having been acquired and maintained through opaque elite arrangements and electoral processes widely believed to be flawed or manipulated, then any articulation of truth, any challenge to the prevailing narrative, can register as an act of rebellion. When the government's connection to the popular will feels tenuous, when trust has eroded, then any public gathering, any protest, however symbolic, can feel like a direct challenge, a nascent referendum on its right to govern. In such an environment, where the bedrock of popular consent feels unstable, repression becomes the default mechanism for maintaining control. This impulse towards repression is not merely a tactical political maneuver. It often carries an ideological undercurrent, a short-term strategy aimed at extinguishing the very idea that an alternative future is possible. It seeks to suppress the imagination of a nation not perpetually beholden to the economic prescriptions of international financial institutions like the IMF, a nation not permanently aligned with or deferential to the interests of former colonial masters or dominant global powers such as France, the United States, or the United Kingdom. It attempts to stifle the hope for a country where leadership genuinely listens to its people, responds empathetically to their needs, and acts with courage and conviction in pursuit of the national interest. The emergence and symbolic power of Ibrahim Traore render these questions particularly urgent and resonant in the present moment. His relative youth starkly highlights the significant generational chasm that characterizes our country's leadership landscape. His direct, often fiery rhetoric stands in sharp contrast to the perceived incoherence or lack of clear direction emanating from the current administration. His posture of bold defiance on the international stage throws into even starker relief what many perceive as our government's subservient or overly cautious stance. It is a historical pattern on the African continent. Leaders who challenge the established order, particularly one influenced by external powers, have frequently faced formidable opposition and even violent suppression. The tragic fates of figures like Kwame Nkrumah, Samora Machel, Patrice Lumumba, and Thomas Sankara litter the post-independence history of the continent, serving as grim reminders of the risks associated with challenging deeply entrenched interests. Yet, history also demonstrates that even in death, the ideas championed by such figures possess remarkable resilience. Their voices, though silenced physically, continue to echo through time, and in the contemporary era, amplified by the pervasive reach of social media and digital communication, these voices travel faster, resonate more deeply with new generations, and inspire in ways previously unimaginable. The attempts to suppress the symbolism of a figure like Traore, far from diminishing his impact, often serve only to draw greater attention to him and the ideas he represents, inadvertently magnifying his influence. History, a stern and patient observer, offers a clear lesson. Regimes that rely primarily on repression, no matter how formidable their current hold on power appears, are ultimately vulnerable. The will of the people may be momentarily stifled, but silence is rarely permanent. Economic crisis, while initially potentially paralyzing, also serves as a powerful catalyst for resistance. The deeper the government entrenches itself in a strategy of fear and intimidation, the more inevitable the eventual popular reaction becomes. By reacting with such force to expressions of solidarity with a figure like Traore, the current government, perhaps inadvertently, is adding fuel to an already smoldering fire. It validates the idea that Traore is more than just a leader. He is a symbol of youth, of resistance, of a burgeoning reawakening of African consciousness and agency. In doing so, our country, once held up as a beacon of hope on the continent, risks being increasingly viewed as both a tragedy, a nation blessed with immense potential, brilliant minds, abundant resources, and a rich heritage of civic activism, and a cautionary tale of managed decline. And yet, confronted with this reality, the inclination appears not to be towards course correction, towards genuinely addressing the underlying economic and social grievances, but rather towards doubling down on curtailing fundamental freedoms, clamping down on free speech, and intimidating those who dare to critique or challenge the prevailing order. But the populace, it must be understood, is not oblivious. Citizens are watching the unfolding events. They are listening to the narratives, both official and unofficial. They are reading, learning, and forming their own conclusions about figures like Ibrahim Traore, and the dynamics at play both within their borders and across the continent. They are drawing comparisons between what they see elsewhere and the realities they experience daily, and history suggests that such observation and contemplation eventually translate into action. When that moment arrives, it is unlikely to be deterred by arbitrary arrests or held back by the deployment of secret police. The power of a populace galvanized by shared experience and a desire for change transcends such measures. The cautionary words of thinkers who have observed the interplay between economic upheaval and political dynamics bear repeating. It is in times of severe economic crisis that the conditions can become ripe for the emergence of authoritarian figures who promise simple answers and demand absolute obedience. But it is also precisely in these moments of profound challenge that citizens are often compelled to rediscover and assert their collective power, recognizing that their fate rests ultimately not in the hands of those who would suppress them, but in their own capacity for solidarity, resilience, and sustained demands for dignity and change. History, as the late Professor Pius Adesanmi so vividly put it, is watching, perched high with a koboko, a whip, on the rafters, observing, recording, and awaiting the unfolding consequences of the choices made today. The ultimate accountability, though it may be delayed, is seldom escaped. Thanks for listening. If you find these explorations of global dynamics insightful, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring you in-depth analysis of the forces shaping our world. Subscribe now to stay informed and engaged.